Imagine a world with no cities, no empires, no religions as we know them. Just humans, desperate and sweating under a merciless Middle Eastern sun, searching for one thing and one thing only: water. Now picture a single spring bubbling out of a rocky hillside somewhere between the Mediterranean coast and the edge of a brutal desert. Around 3500 BCE, a small group of people stopped walking. They looked at the water. They looked at the three deep ravines surrounding the hill above it. And they made a decision that would accidentally create the most fought over, most conquered, most obsessed over piece of real estate in the entire history of human civilization. They had no idea what they were starting. Nobody does when they just need a drink. The place was called the Gihon Spring. The hill above it would eventually be known as the Ophel, and the city that grew there, slowly, chaotically, violently, would one day be called Jerusalem. But in 3500 BCE, none of those names existed. There were no priests chanting prayers, no soldiers sharpening swords in its name, no pilgrims weeping at its walls. There was just a group of human beings who found reliable water in a landscape that could kill you for not having it. That's the entire founding story of one of the world's most mythologized cities. Not divine intervention, not destiny. Water, the most mundane and most essential substance on Earth. Archaeological excavations on the southeastern hill of what is now Jerusalem, specifically in the area known as the City of David, have pushed back the timeline of human settlement here to the late Chalcolithic period, somewhere around 3000 BCE, with some evidence suggesting even earlier activity reaching back centuries before that. The earliest traces are not dramatic. No monumental architecture, no royal inscriptions, no signs of organized religion. What archaeologists found were the modest remnants of people living in close proximity to the Gihon Spring. Basic structures, pottery fragments, the bones of animals they had eaten. Ordinary life at the edge of something extraordinary. What made the location strategically brilliant, even if the first settlers chose it purely for survival, was its natural geography. The hill sat at the intersection of three ravines. To the east ran the Kidron Valley, deep and steep. To the west ran the Central Valley, known later as the Tyropion. To the south, the Hinnom Valley cut a wide gash through the landscape. These weren't just aesthetic features, they were natural walls. Any attacker approaching this settlement would have to come uphill, fighting against terrain the entire way. The only relatively flat approach was from the north, which meant defenders only had one serious direction to worry about. For a pre-Bronze Age community with no standing army, no siege equipment, and no professional military of any kind, this geography was the difference between survival and annihilation. Then there was the water itself. The Gihon Spring was one of the very few perennial freshwater sources in the entire hill country of what is now Israel and Palestine. In an environment where rainfall is seasonal and unpredictable, where the landscape bakes and cracks under summer heat, a guaranteed year-round source of flowing water wasn't just convenient, it was power. Whoever controlled the Gihon controlled life in the surrounding region. Farmers could irrigate, animals could drink, travelers stopped here, trade routes bent toward it. Slowly, almost inevitably, a settlement grew into a town, and a town began to attract the attention of people far more powerful than its original inhabitants. By the Middle Bronze Age, roughly the 18th and 17th centuries BCE, something remarkable had happened at this hillside settlement. The people living there, part of the broader Canaanite cultural world that stretched across the Levant, had built walls. Not modest wooden fences or earthen berms, but massive stone fortifications, using boulders weighing 4 to 5 tons each, stacked to heights of approximately 8 meters, over 26 feet. Modern archaeologists who excavated these structures in the 20th century were, frankly, stunned. The scale of construction represented an enormous investment of human labor and engineering sophistication that nobody had expected to find at such an early date in this particular location. The walls weren't built for show. They were built specifically to protect the water system, to ensure that even during a siege, the people inside the city could access the Gihon Spring without exposure to enemy attack. Think about what that means for a moment. The builders of these fortifications were thinking defensively at a level of strategic complexity that implies real experience with organized warfare. They weren't just building a wall around their houses. They were engineering a system that integrated the city's survival with its water supply, creating a fortified envelope around the most critical resource they possessed. This is Bronze Age urban planning, and it's happening in a city that most of the ancient world would barely have heard of yet. The Gihon Spring wasn't just the reason people came here. It was now the beating heart around which an entire military architecture had been constructed. It was also around this period, roughly 1900 to 1800 BCE, that the city received its first appearance in the written historical record, and the context is remarkable. Egyptian scribes, working in the service of pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom, produced a series of documents known today as the execration texts. These were ritual objects, ceramic figurines or pottery vessels inscribed with the names of enemies, foreign rulers, and hostile cities, which were then deliberately smashed as part of a magical ceremony intended to neutralize threats to Egypt. Among the names listed was Rusalimum, Jerusalem, or rather, the city that would one day become Jerusalem, named here for the very first time in recorded human history, as an enemy to be ritually destroyed by one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth. This is worth sitting with. The first time the name of this city appears anywhere in written history, it appears on an Egyptian curse tablet, not a treaty, not a trade agreement, not a letter of friendship, a curse. Egypt, at this point, was the dominant superpower of the Eastern Mediterranean world. The pharaohs controlled vast territories, commanded enormous armies, and viewed the city-states of Canaan as vassal entities to be managed, taxed, and occasionally threatened into compliance. The fact that Jerusalem, this hillside town with its spring and its impressive but ultimately modest walls, warranted inclusion on an Egyptian curse list tells us something important. By 1900 BCE, this city was already significant enough to be noticed and powerful enough to be feared by the greatest empire of its age. The name itself is fascinating and contested. Rusalimum, Urusalim. The exact etymology has been debated by scholars for generations. One prominent interpretation holds that the name derives from a Semitic root meaning foundation, combined with Shalem, a Canaanite deity associated with dusk or the evening star, sometimes interpreted as a god of peace or completeness. Under this reading, Jerusalem means something like foundation of Shalem or Shalem has founded. Another interpretation connects it to the Semitic word for peace, shalom in Hebrew, salam in Arabic, though linguists note that the peace interpretation may be more folk etymology than historical fact. What's certain is that the name is Semitic, it's ancient, and it carries within it the echo of a religious world that predates Judaism, Christianity, and Islam by centuries. The city was named for a god that almost nobody today has ever heard of. Between roughly 1550 and 1400 BCE, Jerusalem came under direct Egyptian domination. The New Kingdom pharaohs, Ahmose I, Thutmose I, and their successors, expanded aggressively into Canaan, incorporating the city-states of the Levant into Egypt's imperial system. Jerusalem became a vassal, its local rulers technically independent, but practically subordinate to the Egyptian crown. They paid tribute, they provided laborers, they sent their sons to Egypt as hostages and received Egyptian education in return. The city was, at this point, one of several small competing Canaanite urban centers, none of them particularly dominant, all of them jockeying for position and Egyptian favor in a landscape of perpetual low-level rivalry. Then came the Amarna period, one of the strangest episodes in all of ancient Egyptian history. Around 1350 BCE, the pharaoh Akhenaten had restructured Egyptian religion around the worship of a single solar deity, the Aten, disrupting the traditional religious order and creating administrative chaos that rippled outward across Egypt's entire imperial network. In the Levant, this chaos manifested as a breakdown of Egyptian administrative control. Local rulers, no longer receiving reliable military support or clear directives from a coherent central authority, descended into conflict with each other. It was during this period that a remarkable archive of diplomatic correspondence was discovered in the 19th century at a site called Tel el Amarna in Egypt. 382 clay tablets covered in cuneiform script containing letters written by vassal rulers across Canaan to the pharaoh's court. 6 of these letters were written by a man named Abdi-Hiba, the ruler of Jerusalem. Abdi-Hiba's letters are extraordinary documents. They are among the oldest direct human communications ever recovered from the ancient Near East, and in them, the ruler of Jerusalem sounds like a man on the edge of complete breakdown. He writes in desperate, urgent terms. The city is under attack. The surrounding territories are being seized. Enemies are advancing. And the pharaoh is doing nothing. The Habiru are plundering all the lands of the king, he writes, referring to a group of raiders or displaced peoples whose identity has been debated ever since. Some scholars have connected them to the ancestors of the Hebrew people, though this remains deeply contested. If no troops come this year, then all the lands of the king will be lost. He protests his own loyalty repeatedly, almost frantically. He did not inherit his position from his father, he says, but received it directly from the pharaoh's own hand. He was appointed by the god-king himself. He is faithful. He is loyal. Please, send soldiers. The pharaoh, absorbed in his religious revolution and apparently indifferent to the collapse of his Levantine holdings, did not respond in any meaningful way. Abdi-Hiba's letters received no military relief. Whether Jerusalem fell to its enemies, or whether Abdi-Hiba managed to hold on through diplomacy and local maneuvering, the tablets don't tell us. What they give us is something far more valuable than military outcomes. They give us a human voice. A man sitting in a city on a rocky hill somewhere in the Judean highlands, writing in panic to a distant king who wasn't listening, watching his world come apart around him. It's the oldest surviving first-person account of life in Jerusalem, and it reads like a desperate email to an unresponsive boss during a company crisis that's about to become catastrophic. The Late Bronze Age, which had sustained an interconnected world of trading empires stretching from Egypt to Mesopotamia to the Aegean, collapsed around 1200 BCE in one of the most dramatic civilizational breakdowns in human history. The great powers, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, Ugarit, the Egyptian New Kingdom, all crumbled within decades of each other. The causes remain disputed: climate change, drought, earthquakes, migration of the sea peoples, internal rebellion, or, most likely, some devastating combination of all of these. Cities that had stood for centuries were burned and abandoned. Trade networks that had connected the ancient Mediterranean world dissolved overnight. The Bronze Age ended not with a gradual decline, but with something that looks, from the archaeological record, almost like an apocalypse. Jerusalem survived. Diminished, isolated, cut off from the Egyptian imperial network that had sustained it for generations, but physically intact. The city on the hill, with the spring in the valley below it, kept going. While great capitals fell into ash and ruin around it, this small Canaanite city-state endured. Perhaps because it was never grand enough to be a primary target. Perhaps because its geography made it genuinely difficult to assault. Perhaps simply because the people who lived there had spent the previous 15 centuries learning, the hard way, how to hold on. Whatever the reason, as the Bronze Age world collapsed and a new, chaotic, fragmented Iron Age began to emerge from the wreckage, Jerusalem was still standing. And into the power vacuum left by the collapse of Egypt's imperial grip on Canaan walked a new people with a new God, and a story about this particular city that would change everything. Around 1000 BCE, a man named David, shepherd, poet, warrior, outlaw, and eventually king, looked at Jerusalem and decided he wanted it. Not because it was the largest city in Canaan. It wasn't. Not because it was the wealthiest. It wasn't that either. Jerusalem at this point was a modest Canaanite stronghold, still inhabited by a people called the Jebusites, perched on its familiar rocky hill above the Gihon Spring. David wanted it precisely because of what it wasn't. It wasn't in the territory of any of the 12 Israelite tribes. It belonged to nobody in his coalition. It was neutral ground. Taking it would give him a capital city that owed its existence entirely to him, not to tribal politics, not to inherited loyalties, not to the complicated web of alliances and grudges that defined Israelite society. He wanted Jerusalem because it was the perfect political blank slate. What happened next would make this hill the most sacred ground on earth. The Jebusites, according to the biblical account in 2 Samuel, were spectacularly confident about their city's defenses. So confident, in fact, that they reportedly mocked David's approaching army with a taunt that has puzzled historians and biblical scholars for centuries. Something along the lines of, "Even the blind and the lame could defend this city against you." It's the kind of insult that suggests genuine contempt rather than tactical bluster. The Jebusites had been living inside those massive Bronze Age fortifications for generations. They had watched enemies approach and turn back. They had survived the collapse of the Bronze Age world when cities far mightier than theirs had been reduced to smoking rubble. Their confidence, from a purely military standpoint, was not entirely irrational. David took the city anyway. The biblical account mentions a tzinor, a Hebrew word variously translated as water shaft, tunnel, or gutter, as the entry point. The implication is that David's forces found a way into the city not by breaching the walls, but by penetrating the underground water system that connected the city to the Gihon Spring below. Archaeological excavations in the city of David have indeed revealed ancient water shafts and tunnels dating to this general period. And the debate about exactly which tunnel David's men used, or whether the biblical account is even describing a physical infiltration rather than a metaphor, has occupied scholars for decades. What matters historically is the outcome. Around 1000 BCE, Jerusalem fell to David. The Jebusites were displaced or absorbed, and the city entered an entirely new chapter of its existence. David's first act was to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. This was not a casual religious gesture. The Ark, a gilded wooden chest containing, according to biblical tradition, the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments, was the physical embodiment of the God of Israel, the most sacred object in Israelite religion. By bringing it to his new capital, David was doing something with profound political and theological consequences simultaneously. He was fusing the identity of his kingdom with the identity of his people's God, making Jerusalem not just a political capital, but a divine one. The city that had been named for a Canaanite deity called Shalem was now the home of YHWH, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The transformation was total, and it was deliberate. The biblical account describes David dancing in the streets as the ark was carried into Jerusalem, so overcome with religious ecstasy that he shed his royal garments and leaped about in a linen ephod, a kind of priestly undergarment, to the visible disgust of his wife Michal, daughter of the previous king Saul, who watched from a window and expressed her contempt for the spectacle. It's one of those vivid, almost uncomfortably human moments that occasionally punctuate the biblical narrative. A king, stripped of his royal dignity, dancing half-naked through his new capital city, while his wife rolls her eyes from an upstairs window. Whatever the historical truth of the story, it captures something real about what Jerusalem meant to David. This wasn't just politics. This was personal. This was everything. David wanted to build a temple to house the ark permanently, a proper structure, something worthy of the God who had, in David's understanding, given him everything he had, his victories, his kingdom, his life. But according to biblical tradition, God told him no. The reason given was blood. David had fought too many wars, killed too many men. A temple, a house of God, a place of peace and worship, could not be built by hands stained with violence. That task would fall to his son. It was one of the most consequential deferrals in human history. David died having established Jerusalem as the capital of a united Israelite kingdom and having brought the ark there, but without having built the structure that would define the city for the next 1,000 years. He left that to Solomon. Solomon, who came to power around 970 BCE, built the first temple. Archaeological evidence for Solomon's specific construction projects in Jerusalem remains frustratingly limited. The area of the Temple Mount has been continuously occupied, built over, destroyed, and rebuilt for 3,000 years, and excavating beneath the current structures is politically and religiously impossible in any comprehensive sense. What we have instead is the detailed biblical description in the Book of Kings, supplemented by comparative archaeology from the broader ancient Near East. The temple, based on these sources, was a rectangular structure of modest actual dimensions by the standards of ancient monumental architecture, roughly 30 meters long, 10 meters wide, 15 meters tall. What made it extraordinary wasn't its size, but its contents, its significance, and what it represented. It was the house of the God of Israel, built on the threshing floor of a man named Araunah the Jebusite, purchased by David, completed by Solomon. The ark sat in its innermost chamber, the Holy of Holies, in total darkness, behind a veil that only the high priest could pass through once a year on Yom Kippur. The construction of the temple transformed Jerusalem's regional importance overnight. Suddenly, this hilltop city was not just a political capital, but the religious center of an entire people. Pilgrims came from across the Israelite territories. Priests organized a complex liturgical calendar of sacrifices and festivals. The city grew. Solomon expanded the walls northward to include the Temple Mount. He built a royal palace complex adjacent to the temple. The biblical description suggests a construction project that lasted 13 years and consumed enormous quantities of cedar imported from Lebanon, stone quarried from the Judean hills, and bronze cast in foundries in the Jordan Valley. Jerusalem, for the first time in its history, was becoming genuinely grand. It did not last. Solomon died around 930 BCE, and the United Kingdom he and his father had built immediately fractured along tribal fault lines that had never fully healed. The northern tribes broke away, forming the Kingdom of Israel with its capital eventually at Samaria. Jerusalem became the capital of the smaller southern kingdom of Judah. The city that had briefly been the center of a regional power was now the capital of a second-tier state, surrounded by more powerful neighbors and increasingly vulnerable to the ambitions of the great empires rising to its north and south. Within a generation of Solomon's death, the Egyptian pharaoh Shishonk I, the biblical Shishak, marched north and sacked Jerusalem, stripping the temple and the royal treasury of the treasures Solomon had accumulated. It was the first of many such humiliations. The next 2 centuries were a grinding story of survival, occasional prosperity, frequent invasion, and the slow, painful education of a small kingdom in the brutal realities of ancient Near Eastern geopolitics. The Philistines raided. The Arabians raided. Jehoash of Israel, a king from the northern breakaway kingdom, actually breached the walls of Jerusalem and helped himself to the temple treasury around 786 BCE. The city endured all of it, damaged, diminished, sometimes humiliated, but never destroyed. It had a quality, this city, of absorbing catastrophe and persisting. Maybe it was the geography. Maybe it was the water. Maybe it was the theology that had grown up around it, the conviction of its inhabitants that this particular place was under divine protection. Whatever the reason, Jerusalem kept surviving situations that should, by any rational military calculation, have finished it. The most dramatic near-death experience of the pre-Babylonian period came in 701 BCE, when the Assyrian king Sennacherib launched a campaign against the kingdom of Judah that destroyed 46 fortified cities, deported over 200,000 people, and eventually arrived at the walls of Jerusalem itself. The Assyrian Empire at this point was the most terrifying military machine the ancient world had ever produced. Its armies were disciplined, technologically advanced, and completely without mercy. Their own records describe their campaigns in terms of deliberate mass terror. Cities burned, populations impaled, kings humiliated before being executed. When Sennacherib turned toward Jerusalem, the city's king, Hezekiah, had every rational reason to expect that his capital would be added to the long list of Assyrian atrocities. Hezekiah did something remarkable. Knowing the siege was coming, possibly years before it arrived, he launched one of the most extraordinary engineering projects in the ancient world. He ordered the construction of a tunnel, now known as Hezekiah's Tunnel, or the Siloam Tunnel, that would carry water from the Gihon Spring, which lay outside the city walls and would be immediately controlled by any besieging army, to the Pool of Siloam inside the protected area of the city. The tunnel ran for 533 meters through solid bedrock. It was cut by 2 teams of workers starting from opposite ends and meeting somewhere in the middle, in the dark, underground, with no GPS, no surveying instruments beyond the most basic tools, and no way to communicate between the teams except by listening for the sound of hammering through the rock. They met. The tunnel worked. It still works today, and you can wade through it. Inside the tunnel, near where the 2 teams met, ancient workers carved an inscription into the rock wall celebrating their achievement. Written in the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet, one of the oldest known examples of extended Hebrew text ever discovered, the Siloam inscription describes the moment the 2 groups broke through to each other. The tunnelers struck each toward the other, axe against axe, and the water flowed from the spring to the pool. It was discovered in 1880, removed from the tunnel wall, and is now housed in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. It is a piece of the actual voice of Iron Age Jerusalem, carved by the hands of workers who knew they were doing something historic, 2,700 years before anyone would find it. The siege came.
Sennacherib surrounded Jerusalem and sent emissaries to demand surrender, reportedly taunting Hezekiah in a speech delivered loudly in Hebrew so that the people on the walls could hear and lose heart. Hezekiah's response, according to the biblical account, was to go to the temple and pray. What happened next is one of the great mysteries of ancient history. Sennacherib did not take Jerusalem.
His own records, preserved in the famous Taylor Prism, now held in the British Museum, describe the campaign, but conspicuously avoid claiming the actual conquest of the city, a notable omission for an Assyrian king, whose inscriptions typically boasted of every victory in exhaustive detail. The biblical account attributes the deliverance to a divine intervention that killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers overnight. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing centuries later, mentions a plague of mice that destroyed the Assyrian army's bowstrings and quivers. Modern historians have proposed bubonic plague, a sudden military emergency elsewhere in the empire, or a negotiated tribute payment that made the siege unnecessary. The truth is that nobody knows exactly why Sennacherib turned back. Jerusalem survived, and the city's inhabitants drew an obvious theological conclusion: God had protected them. This conviction, that Jerusalem was under divine protection, that it could not ultimately fall, would shape the city's psychology for the next century. It would also make what happened in 586 BCE all the more catastrophic. Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon was not a man who accepted theological arguments about divine protection. He had already taken Jerusalem once, in 597 BCE, carrying off the king, the nobility, the skilled craftsmen, and the treasures of the temple in a first wave of deportation. When Jerusalem rebelled against Babylonian rule, encouraged by promises of Egyptian military support that never materialized, he came back. The siege of 586 BCE lasted approximately 18 months. The city's food ran out. The walls were finally breached. The Babylonian army poured through. What followed was, by the standards of ancient warfare, comprehensive destruction. The temple was burned, its bronze pillars melted down, its treasures carried to Babylon. The royal palace was burned, the walls were demolished. The surviving population, those who hadn't died of starvation or been killed in the fighting, was marched into exile in Mesopotamia. Jerusalem was left as a ruin, its population reduced to a remnant of the poorest inhabitants who had nothing worth carrying away. The destruction of the First Temple was not just a military event, it was a theological earthquake. The entire architecture of Israelite religion had been built around the temple, the sacrificial system, the presence of God in the Holy of Holies. If God lived in the temple, and the temple had been burned to the ground, what did that mean? The answers that Israelite thinkers worked out during the Babylonian exile, recorded in texts that would eventually become large portions of the Hebrew Bible, were revolutionary. God was not confined to a building. God was not defeated by Babylon. The exile was not evidence of divine abandonment, but of divine punishment, a correction, not a termination. The relationship between God and his people was portable. It could survive geography. It could survive the loss of the land, the city, the temple itself. Out of the ashes of Jerusalem, a new kind of religion was being invented, one that didn't need a city to exist, one that could travel anywhere its people traveled, one that would eventually give birth to two of the other great monotheistic traditions. The Babylonians had burned down a building. They had accidentally created a world religion. Then, in 539 BCE, something happened that nobody in the ancient world could have predicted. Babylon fell. The Persian king, Cyrus the Great, swept through Mesopotamia and took the greatest empire of the age in a campaign of almost shocking speed and efficiency. And Cyrus, unlike every conqueror before him, had a policy toward conquered peoples that was almost incomprehensible by ancient standards. He let them go home. He issued a decree. The Cyrus cylinder, now in the British Museum, preserves its spirit, if not its exact text, allowing deported peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. For the Jewish exiles in Babylon, this was nothing short of miraculous. In the book of Isaiah, Cyrus is called the Messiah, the Anointed One, a title that Jewish tradition reserved for the most sacred of figures, now bestowed on a Persian polytheist who almost certainly had never heard of YHWH before conquering Babylon. Around 50,000 Jewish exiles began the long walk back to a city that had been a ruin for 50 years. What they found when they arrived was not a city. It was a memory of one. The walls were collapsed rubble. The Temple Mount was a field of burned stone and ash. The streets that had once carried pilgrims and merchants and the processions of kings were overgrown and silent. 50 years of abandonment had done what 18 months of Babylonian siege had begun. The returnees stood in the ruins of the city their grandparents had wept for in Babylon, beside the rivers of Mesopotamia, in the most famous lament in all of ancient literature. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. Now they were back, and Zion was a disaster area. They rolled up their sleeves and started building anyway. What they built over the next 5 centuries would be destroyed twice more, fought over by empires that hadn't yet been born when they first broke ground, and would ultimately produce a complex of buildings so magnificent that one of the greatest rulers of the ancient world would be told by the Talmud that he who had not seen it had never seen a beautiful building in his life. The Second Temple was completed around 515 BCE, roughly 70 years after Nebuchadnezzar had burned the first one. It was, by most accounts, a modest structure compared to its predecessor, smaller, less richly furnished, built by a community that was poor, exhausted, and demographically depleted. The prophet Haggai records that older men who remembered the first temple wept when they saw the foundation of the new one because it looked so much less impressive. But it was standing. After everything, the siege, the destruction, the exile, the long march home, Jerusalem had a temple again. The city was alive again, and now, for the first time in its history, it would face not just military conquest, but something in some ways more dangerous: the seductive, comprehensive, deeply appealing cultural invasion of the Greek world. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great arrived in the Levant like a force of nature that nobody had prepared adequate vocabulary to describe. He had already destroyed the Persian Empire, the power that had, ironically, been Jerusalem's liberator and protector for 2 centuries. Darius III was fleeing. The cities of the Phoenician coast were falling one by one, and Jerusalem, watching the approaching storm from its hilltop, made a calculation. According to Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian whose accounts of this period are our primary non-biblical source and whose reliability historians debate endlessly, the high priest of Jerusalem had a dream in which he was told to open the gates and receive Alexander with honor rather than resist him. Whether or not this dream actually happened, the political logic was sound. Jerusalem opened its gates. Alexander reportedly visited the temple, offered sacrifices, or at least observed them with respect, and confirmed the city's existing rights and religious freedoms. He marched on. The conquest of Jerusalem took approximately no time and cost approximately no lives. What Alexander left behind him was far more transformative than any military occupation. Greek language, Greek philosophy, Greek architecture, Greek athletic culture, Greek modes of thought. The entire package of what historians call Hellenism began flowing into Judea with the momentum of a civilization utterly confident in its own superiority. And the thing about Hellenism was that it was genuinely attractive. It wasn't just imposed by force. Greek was the international language of commerce, diplomacy, and intellectual life across the entire Eastern Mediterranean. If you wanted to participate in the wider world, if you wanted to trade, to travel, to be taken seriously by the educated elites of Alexandria or Antioch or Athens, you needed Greek. You needed to understand Greek ideas. Younger generations of Jerusalem's Jewish elite began adopting Greek names, building gymnasiums, engaging with Greek philosophy, wearing Greek clothing. The old boundaries between Jewish and Greek culture began to blur in ways that horrified the traditionalist religious establishment and delighted the cosmopolitan urban class. After Alexander died in 323 BCE, in Babylon, at 32, of causes that historians still argue about, his empire was carved up by his generals in a series of wars that lasted decades. Jerusalem initially fell under the control of the Ptolemaic dynasty based in Egypt, who ruled it relatively tolerantly for about a century. Then, in 198 BCE, the Seleucid Empire based in Syria wrested control of Judea away from the Ptolemies at the Battle of Panium. The Seleucids were Greek in culture and language, heirs to the eastern portion of Alexander's empire, and initially their rule over Jerusalem was not dramatically different from what had come before. But within 30 years, a Seleucid king would commit an act of such stunning religious provocation that it would ignite a revolt, transform Jewish identity, and produce a holiday that Jewish families still celebrate every year more than 2,000 years later. Antiochus IV Epiphanes became king of the Seleucid Empire in 175 BCE. The epithet Epiphanes means God manifest. He believed himself to be a divine figure, a living embodiment of Zeus. His Jewish subjects, with the particular gift for cutting nicknames that persecuted peoples often develop, called him Antiochus Epimanes instead. Epimanes means the Mad One. What he did to Jerusalem, beginning in 169 BCE, justified the nickname. Returning from a partially successful campaign against Egypt that had been humiliatingly interrupted by a Roman ultimatum, a Roman ambassador had literally drawn a circle in the sand around Antiochus and told him to decide whether he was going to withdraw from Egypt before he stepped out of the circle. Antiochus took out his fury on Jerusalem. He entered the temple, stripped it of its remaining treasures, and massacred or enslaved thousands of the city's inhabitants. 2 years later, he went further. He issued edicts banning the practice of Judaism entirely. Circumcision was outlawed, Sabbath observance was forbidden, possession of the Torah scrolls was made punishable by death. And in December of 167 BCE, he erected an altar to Zeus in the Jerusalem temple and sacrificed a pig on it. The pig on the altar of the Jerusalem temple. It is difficult to overstate what this act meant to observant Jews. The pig was the paradigmatic unclean animal in Jewish dietary law, the most explicitly forbidden creature in the entire taxonomy of prohibited foods. Sacrificing one on the holiest altar in the world wasn't just religious insult. It was a statement of total contempt, a deliberate desecration designed to communicate that the God of Israel was defeated, subordinated, erased. The Book of Daniel, written in response to this crisis, calls it the abomination of desolation. It is a phrase that echoed forward through centuries of apocalyptic literature, through the New Testament, through medieval theology, all the way to the present day. One king's act of theatrical cruelty became one of the most resonant images in the entire history of Western religious thought. The response was the Maccabean Revolt. It began in a village called Modin, northwest of Jerusalem, where a priest named Mattathias refused to perform a pagan sacrifice when ordered to by a Seleucid official, and then killed both the official and a fellow Jew who had stepped forward to comply. Mattathias and his 5 sons fled to the Judean hills and began a guerrilla campaign against the Seleucid army and their Jewish collaborators. After Mattathias died, leadership passed to his son Judah, whose nickname was Maccabee, most likely meaning the hammer. What followed was 3 years of asymmetric warfare in the Judean highlands. Small, mobile bands of Jewish fighters using knowledge of the terrain to harry, ambush, and repeatedly defeat Seleucid armies that were larger, better equipped, and completely unprepared for the kind of fight they were getting. In 164 BCE, the Maccabees recaptured Jerusalem. They purified the temple, removed the altar of Zeus, and rededicated the building to the God of Israel. The celebration of this rededication, Hanukkah, from the Hebrew word for dedication, has been observed every year since. The Maccabean Revolt produced the Hasmonean dynasty, the only period of genuine Jewish political independence between the Babylonian conquest of 586 BCE and the establishment of the modern State of Israel in 1948. It lasted about a century, and it was not a particularly edifying spectacle. The Hasmonean rulers combined the offices of high priest and king in a manner that many religious Jews found theologically offensive. They expanded Judean territory aggressively, forcibly converting conquered populations to Judaism, a practice almost unheard of in ancient Jewish tradition. They feuded viciously among themselves, with different branches of the family repeatedly going to war with each other. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, 2 Hasmonean brothers were fighting a civil war for control of Jerusalem, and both sides made the catastrophic decision that would end Jewish independence for the next 2,000 years. They appealed to Rome. The Roman general Pompey arrived in the eastern Mediterranean in 63 BCE, reorganizing the entire region into Roman provinces and client states with the efficient brutality that Rome applied to all geopolitical problems. He took Jerusalem after a 3-month siege. The defending forces had retreated to the Temple Mount, and Pompey's engineers spent months building earthwork ramps to bring siege engines level with the temple walls. When the walls were finally breached, Pompey did something that demonstrated either his curiosity or his contempt, depending on your perspective. He walked into the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber of the temple, where no one but the high priest was permitted to enter. He looked around. He found, by his own account, nothing. No statue, no image, no visible representation of the god worshipped there. The concept of a god without a physical form was so alien to Greco-Roman religious sensibility that Pompey reportedly found the empty chamber simply baffling. He left the temple's treasures untouched and walked out. Jerusalem was now, effectively, a Roman possession. Into this world of Roman domination, Hasmonean dysfunction, and simmering Jewish resentment stepped one of the most complex, contradictory, and genuinely fascinating figures in all of ancient history: Herod, who would eventually be called the Great, and who would transform Jerusalem into something that would cause the Roman writer Pliny the Elder to describe it as by far the most famous city of the ancient East.
Herod was the son of an Idumean official. Idumea was a region south of Judea whose population had been forcibly converted to Judaism by the Hasmoneans a generation earlier. This made Herod Jewish by religion, but not by ethnic origin, a distinction that his Jewish subjects never let him forget, and that defined his entire relationship with the people he ruled. He was not one of them. He knew it, they knew it. And he spent his entire reign simultaneously trying to prove himself to them and being driven to murderous rage by their refusal to accept him. Herod became king of Judea in 37 BCE, after a military campaign backed by Rome that ended the Hasmonean dynasty definitively. He would rule for 33 years, and his reign was a study in extremes so dramatic that it reads less like history than like a psychological case study in the relationship between genius and madness. He was a builder of extraordinary vision and capability. The structures he commissioned were among the most technically ambitious construction projects in the entire ancient world. He was also a man who had his own wife executed, then grieved for her so intensely that he reportedly had her body preserved in honey and continued to talk to it. He killed 3 of his own sons, causing the Emperor Augustus to remark that it was better to be Herod's pig than Herod's son. The joke being that as a nominally Jewish king, Herod wouldn't eat pork, so the pig was actually safer than his children. What Herod did to Jerusalem was staggering. He expanded the Temple Mount, the platform on which the temple stood, into the largest religious precinct in the ancient world. The natural hill was insufficient for his ambitions, so he effectively created a new hilltop by building massive retaining walls and filling in the space behind them with rubble, creating an artificial plateau of approximately 35 acres. The retaining walls he built still stand today. The Western Wall, the most sacred site in contemporary Judaism, the place where millions of Jews have pressed written prayers into the ancient stones, is a surviving section of Herod's retaining wall. Not the temple itself, not even the temple platform, but the outer wall of the earthworks that supported it. When people touch the Western Wall today, they are touching Herod's construction project. The temple Herod built on this platform was, by every account that has survived, breathtaking. The Talmud records the judgment that became one of antiquity's most repeated architectural assessments. He who has not seen the temple of Herod has never seen a beautiful building in his life. Tacitus, the Roman historian who had no particular reason to compliment anything Jewish, wrote that Jerusalem's temple possessed enormous riches. Josephus describes exterior walls covered in white marble and gold that blazed in the morning sun so brightly that travelers approaching Jerusalem from a distance could not look directly at the building. The Temple Mount complex contained enormous courtyards, colonnaded porticos, gates of such scale that Josephus describes one of them, the Nicanor Gate, as requiring 20 men to open and close. Herod built a city around the temple complex to match, new aqueducts to bring water from sources miles away, a theater, an amphitheater, a hippodrome for chariot racing, a royal palace in the western part of the city that Josephus describes as surpassing all description. The bitter irony at the heart of all this magnificence was the one thing Herod could never change. He was not permitted to enter the innermost areas of his own temple. Jewish law restricted access to the temple's sacred inner courts to Jews of priestly descent. Herod, as an Idumean, was excluded. The most spectacular religious building in the ancient world, constructed by his hands, financed by his treasury, designed according to his vision, and he could never set foot in its most sacred spaces. He built a house for a God who, in the theology of his own subjects, did not fully recognize him as one of the faithful. It is one of history's great tragic ironies. The man who gave Jerusalem its most glorious architectural moment was also the man his own people could never fully accept.
The city he made magnificent would outlive his dynasty by barely a generation before the Romans came back. This time not to reorganize, but to destroy. And the temple he had spent decades building would be gone within 100 years of his death, burned to the ground in 70 CE by Titus, leaving behind only the retaining wall, the stones that people still touch today, still weeping, still praying, still pressing small folded papers into the ancient cracks, still talking to a God in a building that no longer exists.